3 o'clock in the morning. The isolated intensive care unit of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. The cold steel of a matte black pistol pressed hard against my forehead. Marcus Sterling, actively bleeding out from a catastrophic abdominal wound, glared at me with the hollow, desperate eyes of a cornered predator. "Fix me, doctor," he wheezed, his blood-slicked fingers trembling violently on the trigger. "Pack the wound and stop the bleeding, or you die on this floor with me." Suddenly, the heavy double doors groaned open. Julian Thorne stepped into the blinding white light, his face carved from pure, lethal granite, a suppressed weapon perfectly leveled at Marcus's skull. "Step away from her, Marcus," Julian whispered. His voice wasn't a shout, it was a freezing, glacial rasp that made the room drop 10 degrees. "You have exactly 3 seconds to pull that gun away from my wife, or I scatter your brains across this sterile room." I stood frozen in the crossfire, a chief trauma surgeon trapped between a ruthless cartel kingpin and the underworld titan who also happened to be my fiancé's brother. The same man who had silently loved and guarded my life from the dark for 11 long years. Discover how a woman dedicated to saving lives became the ultimate prize in a deadly syndicate war. Don't forget to subscribe to Dark Romance Stories, and leave a comment below to step out of the shadows with us right now. I thought the worst thing that could happen tonight was losing a patient. Then I walked into my fiancé's office. The scent of ozone, sterile scrub solution, and the metallic tang of dried blood always clung to my skin after a 14-hour shift in the trauma bay, acting as a familiar, grounding armor. As chief of trauma surgery at St. Jude's Memorial, my life was measured in millimeters, in the rhythmic, predictable beep of a heart monitor, and the absolute certainty that if my hands stayed steady, the human body would fight to survive. Tonight had been a battlefield. A multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate had flooded my ER with broken bodies, and I had spent the last several hours painstakingly reconstructing the shattered hepatic artery of a 22-year-old college student. When his vitals finally stabilized, and the rhythmic hum of the machine signaled victory, I felt the familiar, exhaustion-fueled gratitude wash over me. I stripped off my blood-splattered gown, scrubbed my raw hands for the 10th time that night, and thought only of sharing the quiet relief of survival with Liam. Liam Thorne was not just my fiancé of 3 years. He was the hospital's chief administrator, the suave, charismatic executive who managed the bureaucracy so I could manage the flesh and bone. Our relationship had been built on what I believed was a foundation of mutual respect and shared ambition. I was the dedicated healer, and he was the shield that protected my department from budget cuts and corporate interference. With my white coat slung over my shoulder and a lukewarm cup of cafeteria coffee in my hand, I walked down the dimly lit administrative corridor toward his corner office. The hospital was eerily quiet at 3 in the morning, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the ventilation system. As I approached his door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, a warm sliver of light cutting across the polished linoleum floor. The soft murmur of voices drifted out, accompanied by a laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up a sharp, high-pitched giggle that belonged to Elena Vance, the lead pharmaceutical representative for Sterling MedTech. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, splashing dark liquid across my sensible clogs as I pushed the door open entirely. The scene that greeted me was a grotesque caricature of betrayal. Liam was at his mahogany desk, his tailored suit jacket discarded on the floor, while Elena sat perched on the edge of the desk, her skirt hitched up around her thighs. But it wasn't just the physical intimacy that froze the breath in my lungs. It was what Liam was doing with his hands. He wasn't holding her. His fingers were flying across his dual monitor setup, frantically executing command lines in the hospital's secure accounting database. On the screen, a series of encrypted financial ledgers were flashing red, thousands of entries being systematically altered, rerouted, and deleted. When the door clicked against the wall, they both snapped their heads toward me. There was no immediate panic on Liam's face, only a cold, calculating calculus that I had never seen in the man I loved. Clara, Liam said, his voice instantly smoothing out into the practiced, executive baritone he used during board meetings. He didn't rush to cover himself. Instead, he casually hit a sequence on his keyboard, locking the screens. You're off shift early. You should have texted me. What is this? Liam, my voice sounded hollow, echoing in the sterile room as my eyes darted between the locked monitors and the disheveled pharmaceutical rep, who was now uncomfortably smoothing down her dress. Who is she? And what are you doing to the trauma department's restricted endowment funds? Liam sighed, standing up and adjusting his cufflinks with a chilling lack of remorse. What you're seeing is administrative restructuring, Clara. Something far beyond the scope of a surgeon's understanding. You're tired. Go home to the apartment. We'll talk about our relationship in the morning. No, we'll talk about it right now, I said, stepping forward, the trauma surgeon in me taking over, demanding clarity in the middle of a crisis. I reached for the mouse on his desk, intending to force the screen to display the audit trail, but Liam grabbed my wrist. His grip was entirely too tight, bruising the skin over my radial pulse. I said, "Go home, Clara," Liam hissed, his mask completely slipping to reveal a desperate, ugly malice underneath. You've been playing the self-righteous hero in the operating room for too long. You think you're untouchable because you save lives. You don't know how this world actually works. You don't know who owns this hospital. And you certainly don't know what I've had to do to keep your precious department afloat. Before I could pull away, Liam reached under his desk and deliberately slammed his palm onto the red emergency lockdown button, a feature reserved for active shooter scenarios or catastrophic security breaches in the administrative wing. Instantly, the overhead lights shifted to a flashing amber, and a piercing siren began to wail through the corridor. Within 90 seconds, the heavy double doors of the administrative suite burst open, and 3 armed hospital security guards, accompanied by 2 men in dark, unmarked tactical gear, rushed into the room. "Sir, what's the situation?" the lead guard demanded, his hand resting on his holster. Liam pointed a trembling, perfectly theatrical finger at me, his face instantly contorting into a mask of horrified betrayal. "Doctor Vance has been caught red-handed. I discovered her attempting to unauthorizedly access the hospital's core financial mainframe to alter patient billing data and cover up a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. When I confronted her, she became physically aggressive and tried to destroy the server bridge." I stared at him, my mind fracturing under the sheer weight of the absurdity. "Liam, you're lying. Look at the screens." He was the one deleting the files. "Check the security cameras. The cameras in this sector underwent a scheduled maintenance blackout 10 minutes ago." Dr. Vance, Elena Vance, spoke up, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy as she adjusted her blouse. "I witnessed the entire thing. I came to deliver the quarterly research metrics, and I saw Dr. Vance threatening Mr. Thorne, demanding he clear her personal offshore routing codes. The security guards didn't hesitate. They knew Liam as the man who signed their paychecks. They knew me only as the demanding surgeon who spent too many hours in the basement bays." The lead guard stepped forward, ruthlessly grabbing my arms and pinning them behind my back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into my wrists, the very wrists I used to perform microsutures on dying children. "Dr. Clara Vance, by order of the Board of Trustees, you are hereby suspended effective immediately," Liam stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority as he stepped forward and tore the hospital ID badge from my white coat, ripping the fabric. "Your medical license is being flagged for emergency review by the State Board, and federal authorities have already been notified of your financial crimes. Get this criminal out of my hospital," as they dragged me down the long, flashing corridor, my shoes scraping against the linoleum. I looked back through the glass partition. Liam was already back at his desk, typing rapidly, systematically erasing my digital footprint. my administrative access, and my entire life's work. I was thrown into the back of an unmarked security transport vehicle in the damp, freezing pre-dawn air, completely crushed, utterly helpless, and facing a federal indictment for a crime I didn't commit, orchestrated by the man I was supposed to marry. The interrogation room at the federal holding facility was a masterclass in psychological degradation. For 12 hours, I sat beneath a buzzing fluorescent light that gave me a pounding migraine, staring at a scratched steel table. The two federal agents who questioned me didn't care about my unblemished medical record, my testimonies from surviving patients, or my desperate explanations regarding Liam's financial manipulation. To them, the digital paper trail was absolute. A dummy corporation registered under my social security number had systematically drained $4 million from St. Jude's restricted trauma endowment over 18 months, with every transaction finalized using my encrypted biometric signature. Liam had spent a year and a half using my life, my identity, as his personal shield against the law. When my public defender finally arrived, an exhausted woman named Sarah who smelled of stale cigarettes, she offered no comfort. "The evidence against you is ironclad on paper, Dr. Vance," she whispered, leaning over the table. "Liam Thorne has turned state's evidence against you. He's painting himself as the whistleblower who uncovered your greed. But there's a silver lining. Due to the high-profile nature of the case and potential threats to your safety before the grand jury convenes, the United States Marshal Service has approved an immediate transfer to a secure federal safe house in upstate New York. We're going to get you out of the city tonight. You'll be safe there while we build a defense." A heavy weight lifted slightly from my chest. Safe, the word felt like a lifeline. I nodded desperately, clutching my arms around my shivering frame. I believed her. I believed that the badge meant protection, that the federal government was an unyielding shield against Liam's malice. 2 hours later, under the cover of a torrential midnight downpour, I was escorted out of the facility's secure underground garage and loaded into the back of a heavily armored transport van. Two silent marshals sat in the front cabin, separated from me by a thick cage of reinforced steel and bulletproof plexiglass. As the van navigated the slick, rain-drenched highways leaving Manhattan, the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers lulled me into a false sense of security. I closed my eyes, believing that the worst of the nightmare was behind me, that once I reached the safe house, the truth would find a way to prevail. But 20 minutes into the drive, the van abruptly deviated from the interstate, its heavy tires crunching onto an unlit, deeply rutted gravel road surrounded by dense pine forest. My trauma surgeon instincts, finely tuned to anomalies, instantly flared. "Agent, why are we off the main highway?" I called out, pressing my face against the steel mesh. There was no answer from the front cabin. Through the dark plexiglass, I saw the driver glance at his secure tactical terminal. A red text string was flashing on his screen. But it wasn't a routing command from the Marshal Service. It was a private, encrypted digital ledger bearing a single, terrifying corporate logo: Sterling Industries. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The federal agents weren't careless. They were compromised. Marcus Sterling, the ruthless billionaire CEO behind Sterling MedTech, the man Liam had been laundering money for, owned the very men who were supposed to protect me. The safe house was a lie. The agents had legally manipulated my transfer paperwork to route me to a black site warehouse in the industrial docks of New Jersey, where Marcus Sterling's cleanup crew was waiting to permanently silence the framed doctor. Suddenly, the van's brakes screeched, the vehicle fishtailing violently on the wet gravel before slamming to a halt. A deafening, metallic crunch echoed through the chassis as a massive, unmarked black armored SUV rammed the transport van from the side, pinning it against a row of towering pines. Before the corrupt agents could draw their sidearms, the side doors of the forest erupted in a blinding flash of tactical strobes and the synchronized, suppressed pops of professional gunfire. The plexiglass partition in front of me shattered as two precision rounds punctured the front windshield, instantly neutralizing the corrupt drivers before they could even radio for assistance. I screamed, throwing myself onto the floor of the cage, covering my head as the side door of the transport van was violently blown off its hinges by a controlled thermal charge. Smoke poured into the cabin, smelling of cordate and burnt rubber. Through the haze, a towering figure stepped into the ruined vehicle. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat over a dark tactical vest, completely unbothered by the chaos around him. He possessed a terrifying, commanding aura that made the armed men outside fall into immediate, silent formation. He stepped over the debris, his dark, piercing eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the breath catch in my throat. He looked at me not with the cold calculation of a captor, but with a raw, ancient recognition that defied the violence of the moment. He reached down his large, calloused hand gripping the lock of my steel cage, with a single brutal twist of a hydraulic tool. He sheared the deadbolt open and reached his hand out to me. "Clacker," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried no hesitation, no alpha posturing, only an absolute unyielding calm. "Get up. We don't have much time." I shrank back against the steel wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who are you? Did Marcus Sterling send you to finish Liam's job?" The man's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his shadowed stubble. "Marcus Sterling is a dog who doesn't realize his leash has already been cut. My name is Julian Thorne. I am the head of the Thorne Syndicate, and I am Liam's older brother." My mind fractured further. Liam had never mentioned an older brother. Liam had claimed his family died in a tragic accident years ago. You're his brother. You're here to kill me to protect his embezzlement." Julian stepped closer, his presence filling the cramped, smoking van. He knelt down to my eye level, his gaze steady, completely communicative, and remarkably gentle given the blood on his knuckles. "I spent the last 11 years tearing my own family's empire apart to keep it from touching you. Clara, 11 years ago, before Liam ever knew your name. I sat in the back of a university lecture hall and watched you defend the sanctity of human life to a room full of jaded bureaucrats. I fell in love with your mind, your fire, your absolute refusal to let the world make you cruel. But I knew what I was, the heir to a blood-soaked throne. So I walked away. I let myself be the monster in the dark, so you could be the healer in the light." He extended his hand again, keeping it perfectly still, giving me absolute agency in a moment where I had none. "Liam is a coward who used my family's old routing codes to build his little playground with Marcus Sterling. He thought he could use your name as a shield because he knew I would never let the authorities harm you. He was right about one thing. I will burn this entire city to ash before I let them put you in a cage. But I will not force you. Clara, outside this van is my armored car. It will take you to my estate, where you will be treated as an absolute equal, where we will use my resources to legally dismantle Liam and Marcus piece by piece. Or you can stay in this ditch and wait for Marcus's next extraction team to arrive. It is entirely your choice." I looked at his open palm. I looked at the dead, corrupt federal agents in the front seat. I looked at the dark, unforgiving forest around us. For the first time in 48 hours, a man wasn't lying to me, wasn't managing me, wasn't treating me like an asset to be traded. He was laying out the brutal, terrifying truth and leaving the door wide open, with trembling fingers. I reached out and placed my hand in Julian Thorne's grip. His fingers closed around mine, warm, steady, and unyielding, as he pulled me out of the wreckage and into the blinding light of a war I never asked to fight. The drive to the Thorne estate was a blur of rain-slicked roads and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the armored SUV's engine. I sat in the spacious rear cabin, wrapped in a thick wool blanket someone had handed me, my mind still violently oscillating between the reality I had known hours ago and the terrifying underworld I had just been thrust into. My wet scrubs clung to my skin, a stark reminder of the surgical suite I had been exiled from. while the faint metallic scent of the explosive breach still lingered in my hair. Julian sat across from me in the dim ambient light of the vehicle, silent and statuesque. He did not hover. He did not attempt to placate me with empty reassurances. He simply watched the perimeter through the reinforced glass, giving me the physical and psychological space I desperately needed to piece my shattered reality back together. When the massive wrought iron gates of his estate finally parted, revealing a sprawling, brutalist stone fortress hidden deep within the forested Hudson Valley, I felt a new wave of apprehension crest over me. I had escaped a federal trap orchestrated by the man I was going to marry, only to be delivered directly into the heavily fortified compound of a syndicate boss. As the vehicle came to a halt beneath a grand portico, Julian stepped out first. The rain had subsided into a fine mist, chilling the early morning air. He opened my door, stepping back to allow me a clear path. He did not reach for my arm or attempt to guide me. His every movement was a deliberate exercise in offering me agency. I stepped onto the wet cobblestones, my sensible hospital clogs feeling entirely out of place against the backdrop of unimaginable wealth and lethal security. Armed men stood in the periphery, their postures rigid and their eyes scanning the tree line. But none of them looked directly at me. Julian led me through the towering mahogany doors and into a vast, vaulted foyer that smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and polished leather. It was not the gaudy, ostentatious palace I would have expected from a criminal empire. It was a fortress of quiet, understated power. "My staff has prepared a guest suite for you in the West Wing," Julian said, his deep voice breaking the heavy silence of the manor. "There are clean clothes, hot water, and a secure perimeter. You are exhausted, Clara. Sleep. When you are ready, we will discuss our next steps." I stopped in the center of the foyer, the adrenaline that had kept me moving suddenly giving way to a fierce, unyielding need for control. I had spent the last 24 hours being managed, manipulated, and traded like a commodity. I refused to spend another second in the dark. I turned to face him, squaring my shoulders despite the tremor in my hands. "No. We discuss this right now. I am not going to sleep in a strange bed in a compound guarded by men with assault rifles without establishing exactly what the terms of my presence here are. I am a trauma surgeon, Julian. I am accustomed to operating under pressure, and I do not function on blind faith, especially not anymore." Julian did not bristle at my defiance. Instead, a faint flicker of genuine respect crossed his sharp features. He gestured toward a set of double doors to our right. "The library, then. I'll have coffee brought in." The library was a massive, circular room lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, anchored by a massive stone fireplace where a low fire crackled steadily. I refused the armchair he offered, choosing instead to stand behind it, keeping a physical barrier between us as a tactical anchor. Julian poured 2 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe that an entirely silent attendant had just delivered, placing one on the desk near me before taking a seat opposite the fire. "Let me make something perfectly clear, Mr. Thorne," I began, my voice cold and clinical, the same tone I used when directing a chaotic emergency room. "I am deeply grateful that you pulled me out of that transport van. You saved my life tonight. But I am not your property. I am not a bargaining chip to be used in whatever underworld war you are waging against Marcus Sterling. And I am certainly not a pawn you can use to leverage your brother. If I am staying in this house, it is as a partner in dismantling the men who destroyed my life. I will not be locked in a gilded cage for my own protection, and I will not have decisions made for me." Before Julian could answer, the library doors swung open. A tall, aggressively built man with severe features and a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow strode into the room. He looked at me with undisguised contempt before turning his attention entirely to Julian. "Boss, the perimeter is locked down, and the cleanup crew at the highway intersection has wiped the digital traffic feeds. But bringing her here is a massive liability. The feds are going to realize she's missing within hours. Marcus will know we have her. She's a civilian. Julian, she doesn't belong here. And keeping her on the premises compromises the entire syndicate. Silas. Julian's voice was dangerously quiet, yet it carried an authority that immediately silenced the other man. Dr. Vance is standing right here. If you have an assessment of her tactical value, you will address her directly. And you will address her with the respect owed to the woman who single-handedly maintained the operational integrity of the largest trauma center in the state. Julian stood up, seamlessly shifting the power dynamic in the room to place me at its center. Clara is not a liability. She is the only person who possesses the intimate, operational knowledge of St. Jude's administrative blind spots. Liam used her credentials to build his network with Marcus. That means the architecture of their laundering scheme is modeled around her schedules, her access codes, and her departmental budgets. Without her intellect, we are striking at shadows. With her, we have the blueprint to tear Marcus Sterling's financial throat out. Silas stared at me, his jaw clenched, before giving a stiff, reluctant nod. Understood. He turned on his heel and exited, pulling the heavy doors shut behind him. The silence rushed back into the room. I looked at Julian, slightly disarmed by the absolute, uncompromising way he had just defended my intellect to his inner circle. He hadn't defended me as a fragile woman in need of saving. He had defended me as a strategic asset, an equal. He's just doing his job, Julian said softly, sitting back down. But he needed to understand the hierarchy. You are not a guest here, Clara. You are a sovereign entity. I crossed my arms, the warmth of the coffee cup seeping into my cold palms. You said you watched me 11 years ago, in a university lecture hall. You said you tore your family's empire apart to keep it away from me. I need to understand what that means, Julian. Because my entire life has just been exposed as a lie constructed by your brother. I need the truth. Julian leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. The shadows of the fire danced across his face, highlighting the deep lines of exhaustion and the heavy burden of his crown. 11 years ago, my father was assassinated. I was 29. And I was suddenly handed the keys to a syndicate that was drowning in old blood and senseless violence. I was trying to figure out how to transition our family into legitimate logistics and security without sparking a civil war. One afternoon, I was walking across the campus of Columbia University to meet with a forensic accountant. I ducked into a random auditorium to take a phone call. You were on the stage. It was a panel on the ethics of emergency triage. His eyes met mine, holding a gaze so profoundly steady and communicative that it felt like a physical touch. You were arguing with a senior hospital administrator. He was advocating for prioritizing patients based on insurance brackets during mass casualty events. You tore his argument apart with such brilliant, clinical ferocity. You said that the human body doesn't possess a socioeconomic status on the operating table, and that the moment a doctor looks at a patient and sees a balance sheet, they have violated the very sanctity of life. I stood in the back of that room and watched you, and for the first time in my life, I saw something entirely pure, something uncorrupted by the world I lived in. I swallowed hard, my heart beating an erratic rhythm against my ribs. I remembered that panel. I had nearly been suspended from my residency for my insubordination that day. You were there. I was, Julian said quietly. I made it my business to know who you were. I followed your career. I watched you climb the ranks, fighting tooth and nail for every grant, every promotion. I realized very quickly that you were a force of nature. And I also realized that the world I inhabited, a world of violence, coercion, and systemic corruption, would extinguish your fire if I ever brought you into it. So I made a choice. I chose to stay in the dark. When your department needed funding, I set up anonymous shell corporations to supply the grants. When the local gangs started encroaching on the blocks around your apartment, I had my men aggressively clear the district to ensure you could walk home safely at 3 a.m. I didn't want to possess you, Clara. I only wanted to ensure that the world remained safe enough for you to thrive in it. The revelation washed over me, dismantling the horrifying assumption that he had been stalking me. This wasn't the toxic, obsessive control of a predator. This was a profound, agonizing sacrifice. He had loved me enough to let me go, choosing to act as a silent sponsor of my dreams rather than dragging me into his nightmares. And Liam? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Did he know? Liam knew nothing. Julian's face hardened into a mask of pure ice. Liam has always been a coward, desperate to prove he could build an empire without my oversight. I severed ties with him years ago when I found out he was skimming off our legitimate businesses to fund his illicit gambling debts. I thought he has gone straight when he took the job in hospital administration. I didn't know he had targeted you. By the time my surveillance teams flagged that he was dating you, he was already deeply entrenched. I couldn't intervene without exposing my surveillance, which would have terrified you and ruined your career. I thought. I thought he actually loved you. I thought he was capable of being the normal, safe life you deserved. When I discovered he was using your credentials to launder money from Marcus Sterling, it was too late to unravel it quietly. I had to wait for him to make his move so I could extract you before Marcus silenced you. I closed my eyes. The magnitude of the betrayal and the depth of Julian's silent devotion colliding in my chest. For 3 years, I had slept next to a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient, disposable shield. And for 11 years, a man I didn't even know existed had structured his entire criminal empire around the singular goal of keeping me safe. I opened my eyes. The clinical, unyielding resolve of a trauma surgeon settling over my frayed nerves. I set my coffee cup down on the mahogany desk and walked around the armchair, standing directly in front of Julian. Liam took my career. He took my medical license, my reputation, and my freedom. He tried to have me killed to cover his tracks. I spent my entire life learning how to save lives, Julian. But I am fundamentally aware that some infections cannot be cured. Sometimes, the only way to save the patient is to amputate the rotting limb. Julian looked up at me, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight and the absolute, unwavering certainty in my voice. What are you saying, Clara? I am saying that I accept your terms, and you will accept mine. I stated, my voice ringing with a fierce, quiet authority. I am not hiding in this house while you fight this war. Tomorrow morning, you are going to introduce me to your cyber division. We are going to rip open Liam's digital architecture. We are going to find the money. And we are going to burn Marcus Sterling's operation to the ground. We are partners in this. Julian, do you understand me? Julian Thorne slowly rose from his chair, towering over me, yet looking at me with a reverence that took my breath away. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing the fabric of my ruined white coat, a gesture of profound respect rather than possession. Beside me, Clara, never behind me. I swear it. The Thorne Syndicate's Cyber Operations Center was located 3 stories beneath the main estate, a sprawling, climate-controlled bunker, humming with the relentless energy of high-end servers and the blue glow of a dozen massive monitors. It was a stark contrast to the antique, wood-paneled library above, functioning as the digital nervous system of Julian's empire. I stood at the center of a large, interactive tactical table, a tablet in my hand, flanked by Julian and his lead cryptographer. A brilliant, heavily tattooed woman introduced to me simply as Cypher. The sterile, cold environment reminded me of an operating room, and I slipped into my analytical mindset with a desperate, focused relief. This was surgery, just on a digital scale. We were dissecting a pathology, hunting for the malignant cells Liam had hidden within my hospital's financial arteries. The initial sweep of Liam's encrypted drive confirms what we already suspected, Cypher said, her fingers flying across her mechanical keyboard. Strings of code cascaded down the primary screen in rapid succession. He was running a sophisticated mirror ledger. For every legitimate transaction processed through the trauma department's endowment, a shadow transaction was executed, siphoning exactly 12.5% into offshore accounts routed through the Cayman Islands. He used your encrypted biometric signature to authorize the transfers. masking them as highly specialized. Experimental surgical equipment procurement. I leaned over the table, staring at the itemized manifest flashing on the screen. That doesn't make any sense, I murmured, my eyes scanning the medical terminology Liam had used as cover. Look at the purchase orders. He authorized the requisition of Class OI titanium cranial plating, advanced ECMO circuits, and pediatric synthetic heart valves. But the delivery routing codes are all designated for receiving Bay 4. What's wrong with Bay 4? Julian asked, stepping closer to my side. His presence was a steady, grounding force, his sharp mind absorbing the data as quickly as I could process it. Receiving Bay 4 is the hospital's designated biohazard and waste disposal loading dock, Eyes explained, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to click together in a horrifying sequence. It is completely isolated from the sterile supply chain corridors. You cannot route sterile, life-saving surgical equipment through a biohazard bay without triggering a massive compliance violation with the Joint Commission. Furthermore, look at the timestamps on the delivery logs. I tapped the screen, expanding a column of data. Every single shipment authorized under these phantom budgets arrived between 2:00 a.m. and 4:00 a.m. on the second Tuesday of every month. That is the exact window when the hospital's primary security mainframe undergoes its scheduled software diagnostic reboot. The cameras in the lower levels are on a rolling 10-minute blind loop during that time. Cypher's eyes widened, her fingers pausing over her keyboard. He wasn't just skimming money. He was using the hospital's logistical infrastructure to move physical cargo completely under the radar. The money was just the payment for the transportation network. Can you cross-reference these deliveries timestamps with hospital's VIP ambulance transport logs? I asked, a cold knot of dread beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. Liam spearheaded a new initiative last year, a fleet of discreet, heavily tinted ambulances, ostensibly meant to transport high-profile politicians and celebrities without attracting press attention. He insisted on maintaining sole administrative control over their dispatch schedules. Cypher's keyboard clattered rapidly. A new window opened on the massive screen, displaying the GPS logs and dispatch records for the VIP fleet. I have a match. Every single time a phantom shipment was logged at Bay 4, a VIP ambulance was dispatched to the exact same loading dock. But the ambulances didn't go to any of the hospital's helipads or private recovery suites. They drove directly to a series of industrial warehouses owned by a Shell Corporation subsidiary of Sterling Industries. Marcus Sterling, Julian said, his voice dropping to a lethal. Glacial register. Sterling isn't in the business of stealing medical supplies. He's a logistics broker for the cartels. He moves product, narcotics, weapons. No, I interrupted, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the cargo weight metrics listed on the phantom shipping manifests. I felt physically sick, the clinical detachment I relied upon violently shattering. Julian, look at the specific gravity and weight distributions logged for these medical supplies. A crate of synthetic heart valves weighs less than 10 pounds. These crates are consistently logged at 120 to 150 pounds. Furthermore, they are logging environmental atmospheric control requirements for the cargo holds. You don't need oxygen circulation for titanium cranial plates. The silence in the bunker was absolute, suffocating, and terrifyingly profound. Cypher slowly backed away from her console, her hands covering her mouth. Julian stared at the screen, the horrifying reality of the data settling over him like a shroud of ash. They aren't moving drugs or weapons, I whispered, my voice trembling with a rage so pure and devastating it threatened to break me in half. They are moving people. Liam is using my hospital, a place dedicated to saving human lives, as a sanitized, untraceable transit hub for Marcus Sterling's human trafficking ring. He used my name, my reputation, and my secure clearances to smuggle vulnerable women and children right under the noses of federal regulators. The full weight of my helplessness from the previous night returned, but this time, It was not fueled by despair. It was fueled by an absolute, incandescent fury. I thought of the patients I treated in the trauma bay, the battered women, the broken children, the innocent lives I fought so desperately to pull back from the brink of death, while I was upstairs with my hands buried in their chests, trying to stop the bleeding. The man I was going to marry was downstairs, selling human beings in the dark. I turned away from the table, pacing the length of the bunker, my hands shaking so violently I had to clench them into fists. I felt crushed by the sheer magnitude of the evil I had unwittingly been a shield for. I was a doctor. I took an oath to do no harm. Yet, my blind trust in Liam had allowed Marcus Sterling to inflict unimaginable suffering on countless lives. Julian crossed the room, stepping into my path and gripping my shoulders. His hands were strong, anchoring me to the present, preventing me from spiraling into the abyss of guilt. Clara, look at me. Look at me. This is not your fault. Liam weaponized your goodness. He used your dedication to your patients as a smokescreen for his own depravity. You did not do this, but I have to stop it, I demanded, looking up into his dark, storm-filled eyes. Clearing my name isn't enough anymore. Sending Liam to prison for embezzlement is a joke compared to what he has actually done. We cannot just hand this data over to the FBI. The task force is compromised. Sterling owns the federal agents. He will bury this evidence, silence the victims, and continue operating through a different channel. I know, Julian said quietly, his thumb tracing the line of my collarbone. A gentle grounding touch that stood in stark contrast to the violence brewing in his eyes. I want it dismantled, I said, my voice dropping to a fierce, uncompromising whisper. I don't just want my life back. I want you to help me tear Marcus Sterling's operation out by the roots. I want every single woman and child in that warehouse freed. And I want the men responsible to realize that the white coat they tried to destroy is the thing that is going to sign their death warrant. Julian's hands tightened slightly on my shoulders. He did not look away, nor did he try to shield me from the reality of what I was asking. He treated me as a partner, outlining the brutal truth of the underworld. Clara, if we strike Sterling's primary trafficking hub, it is not a surgical procedure. It is an act of war. It will trigger an all-out blood feud between the Thorn Syndicate and Marcus's entire network. The streets will bleed. Marcus will not hesitate to retaliate against everything I have built, and he will hunt you with every resource he possesses. Once we cross this line, there is no returning to a quiet, civilian life. You will be actively participating in the violent dismantling of a criminal empire. I stared at the man who had silently guarded my dreams for a decade. He was offering me an out, a chance to step back into the light and let him handle the darkness alone. But I had spent my entire career fighting death, refusing to surrender when the monitors flatlined. I was not going to surrender now. The women in those shipping manifests deserved the same relentless, uncompromising fight that I gave my patients on the operating table. I am a trauma surgeon, Julian, I said, my voice steady, my resolve absolute. I am intimately familiar with the fact that sometimes you have to break the ribs to restart the heart. I am not afraid of the blood. I am afraid of letting the cancer spread. Julian Thorne looked at me, a profound, terrifying devotion illuminating his features. He saw me not as a damsel in distress, but as a warrior ready to step onto the battlefield beside him. He turned his head toward the tactical table, his voice echoing through the bunker with the chilling, absolute authority of a king going to war. Cipher, Julian commanded, his eyes never leaving mine. Rouse the tactical teams. Isolate the GPS coordinates for Sterling's New Jersey warehouses. We are going hunting. When you shine a light into the dark, the shadows fight back. The decision to dismantle Marcus Sterling's trafficking ring was not merely a tactical pivot. It was a declaration of absolute war, and the underworld reacted with the swift, merciless violence of a disturbed hornet's nest. For 48 hours after our discovery in the bunker, the Thorne estate transformed into a synchronized military command center. Julian moved with a lethal, calculated precision, stripping away the refined exterior of a legitimate businessman to reveal the ruthless syndicate boss beneath. I watched him dispatch strike teams, freeze offshore accounts, and systematically cut Sterling's logistical supply lines, treating me as an equal partner in every strategic briefing. But Sterling was a veteran of the shadows, a man who had survived decades by anticipating his enemies' moves. He realized almost immediately that the Thorn Syndicate had accessed Liam's encrypted mirror ledger, and rather than retreating, he decided to scorch the earth. The first catastrophic blow landed on a Tuesday evening, just as the sky over the Hudson Valley turned the color of bruised iron. I was in the tactical room with Cypher, reviewing the GPS routes of the VIP ambulances, when Julian's encrypted satellite phone vibrated. I watched his expression flatline, a terrifying stillness that I was quickly learning to associate with immense violence. He ended the call and turned to me, his dark eyes reflecting a hollow, agonizing grief. Sterling's men had bypassed the Syndicate's armored strongholds and targeted the vulnerable. They had firebombed a transitional halfway house in the South Bronx, a sanctuary for domestic abuse survivors that Julian had been secretly funding for years. The news shattered the clinical detachment I had been desperately clinging to. These were innocent women, people who had already survived the darkest chapters of their lives, now reduced to collateral damage in a proxy war. Julian ordered an immediate medical evacuation and dispatched his personal guard to secure the survivors. But the message from Sterling was brutally clear. There were no rules of engagement, and no one was off limits. Before the smoke at the halfway house had even cleared, the second tragedy struck, striking directly at the heart of my past. Dr. Eris, my revered mentor and the former chief of surgery, was the only person left at St. Jude's Memorial whom I implicitly trusted. Earlier that day, against Julian's stern advice, I had contacted him through a burner phone. I had begged him to physically secure the hard drives from the hospital's basement archives, the analog backups that Liam hadn't been able to digitally erase. Eris had agreed without hesitation, his voice trembling with a mixture of outrage and profound loyalty. I waited by the secure terminal for hours, my stomach twisted into a cold, suffocating knot. When the encrypted channel finally chirped, it wasn't Eris's familiar, reassuring voice on the other end. It was Silas, Julian's tactical lieutenant, who had been dispatched to escort Eris from the hospital. Silas's voice was completely devoid of emotion as he delivered the report. They had found Dr. Eris in his private study, 2 suppressed gunshot wounds to the chest. The hard drives were gone. The loss hit me with the kinetic force of a physical blow. Eris had taught me how to hold a scalpel. He had believed in my brilliance when I was just an exhausted resident. Now his blood was on my hands, spilled because I had dared to drag him into a war he was never equipped to fight. I collapsed into a chair in the bunker, the edges of my vision fraying into black as Julian wrapped his arms around me, his silent, grounding presence the only thing tethering me to reality. But grief is a luxury you cannot afford when you are being hunted. In the chaotic, fractured hours following Eris's assassination, our operational security began to buckle under the sheer weight of Sterling's offensive. We needed to relocate the surviving women from the halfway house to a secondary, untraceable safe zone. Julian insisted I stay within the fortified walls of the estate, but my trauma surgeon instincts overrode his tactical caution. I refused to let traumatized, severely burned women be treated by underground combat medics when I possessed the surgical expertise to stabilize them. I demanded to accompany the extraction team. Julian, honoring his promise to treat me as an equal, reluctantly agreed, assigning Silas and a heavily armed detail to shadow my every move. The extraction point was a disused warehouse on the outskirts of Yonkers, a grim, rain-battered structure that smelled of damp concrete and fear. I set up a makeshift triage center, losing myself in the familiar, rhythmic chaos of assessing burns, administering intravenous fluids, and whispering reassurances to terrified survivors. For a fleeting hour, I was back in my element, shielded by the sacred duty of healing. But I had fundamentally underestimated the depths of Liam Thorne's cowardice. Liam, desperate to secure immunity from Marcus Sterling and terrified of his brother's wrath, had sold the one piece of intelligence that could break us. He had leveraged his intimate knowledge of Julian's older, legacy security protocols codes that Silas had hastily reactivated in the chaos of the firebombing. I was in a back room, desperately searching through a medical supply crate for a fresh box of sterile bandages, when the heavy steel door slammed shut, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Before I could even draw a breath to scream, the deafening concussive blast of a flashbang grenade shattered the silence. The world dissolved into blinding white light and a high-pitched, agonizing ringing. Rough, gloved hands grabbed me from the darkness, slamming me against the concrete wall with enough force to knock the wind out of my lungs. A needle pierced the side of my neck, the cold, chemical bite of a heavy sedative instantly flooding my bloodstream. As my muscles went slack and the chaotic shouts of Julian's men echoed faintly in the distance, I realized with a crushing, suffocating certainty that the light I had tried to shine into the darkness had just been extinguished. I was falling into the abyss. And this time, Julian wasn't there to catch me. Stripped of my white coat and my freedom, I had to find out what I was really made of. I regained consciousness on a freezing, damp concrete floor, my mouth tasting of blood and metallic chemical residue. The air in the room was thick and foul, a suffocating mixture of unwashed bodies, raw sewage, and the unmistakable, sour scent of profound human terror. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, flickering light of a single caged bulb overhead, the horrifying reality of my surroundings crystallized. I was not in a standard holding cell. I was in the belly of the beast. It was a massive, subterranean shipping container, retrofitted into a holding pen. And I was not alone, huddled in the shadows, clinging to each other in desperate, silent misery, were over a dozen women and young girls. Their eyes were hollow, their faces bruised, their spirits systematically broken by a machine that traded human flesh for offshore bank deposits. I pushed myself up against the corrugated steel wall, my head swimming with the lingering effects of the sedative. I was a chief of trauma surgery. I had spent my entire adult life commanding operating rooms, dictating the flow of life and death with a scalpel and an arsenal of modern medicine. But in this dark, freezing box, stripped of my credentials, my equipment, and my unyielding federal protections, I was nothing more than inventory. The sheer, crushing weight of my powerlessness threatened to drag me under. But as I looked at the terrified faces around me, the clinical, unyielding resolve that Julian had so deeply admired flared to life in my chest. I crawled toward the nearest group, my voice barely a whisper as I began checking pulses, inspecting wounds, and offering the only thing I had left to give, my absolute, undivided empathy. My attention was immediately drawn to the far corner of the container, where a young girl no older than 16 lay shivering violently beneath a soiled blanket. A sickeningly sweet, necrotic odor hung in the air around her. I crawled to her side, gently pulling back the blanket. Her right leg was wrapped in a crude, blood-soaked rag. When I carefully peeled it away, my heart plummeted into my stomach. The laceration was deep, likely caused by a struggle or a fall against rusted metal, and it was aggressively infected. The tissue was necrotic, radiating heat, and the telltale red streaks of advanced sepsis were creeping up her thigh. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her skin clammy and pale. She was spiraling into septic shock. "Hey, look at me," I whispered, cupping her burning cheek. "I'm a doctor. My name is Clara. I'm going to help you." But there was no help to give. The second peak of my disappointment, a crushing, suffocating avalanche of despair crashed over me. In a trauma bay, this girl would have a central line placed within seconds, flooded with broad-spectrum intravenous antibiotics, aggressive fluid resuscitation, and immediate surgical debridement. Here, in the dark, I had nothing. I tore the cleanest strip of fabric from my own shirt, desperately trying to fashion a clean dressing. I elevated her leg. I held her hand. I whispered every comforting lie I had ever learned in my years of practice. But biology does not respond to good intentions. Without medication, her blood pressure continued to plummet. Her organs were failing, shutting down one by one as the infection ravaged her small, fragile body. I performed chest compressions when her heart eventually stopped, throwing the entirety of my body weight into her sternum, fighting against the inevitable with a ferocity that left my hands bruised and my lungs burning. I pumped until my muscles screamed, until the other women gently pulled me away, their faces streaked with silent tears. She died in my arms on the freezing concrete floor of a shipping container, surrounded by the absolute worst of humanity. I sat back on my heels, my hands covered in her blood, staring at her lifeless face. The white coat couldn't save her. My intellect couldn't save her. I was utterly, profoundly broken, crushed by the realization that my lifelong dedication to healing was meaningless in the face of systemic, unchecked evil. The heavy steel door of the container suddenly groaned open, the harsh glare of halogen work lights spilling into the gloom. Two armed guards stepped in, parting the way for a figure in an impeccably tailored suit. Liam Thorne walked into the cell, holding a pristine white handkerchief over his nose to mask the stench of the room. He looked down at me, kneeling in the dirt with the blood of a child on my hands, and a sickening, triumphant smile spread across his face. "Look how far the mighty have fallen," Liam sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "The great Dr. Clara Vance, chief of surgery, reduced to rolling in the filth with the rest of the cargo. I told you, Clara, I told you that you didn't understand how this world works. You thought you could just team up with my psychotic brother and burn down a multi-million-dollar logistics network because of your precious morality. You're out of your depth." I looked up at the man I had once intended to marry, a week ago. This betrayal would have shattered me. But sitting beside the body of a girl who had died because of his greed, I felt no heartbreak. I felt no residual affection, nor even the chaotic heat of hatred. I looked at Liam Thorne and saw nothing more than a lethal pathogen, a virus that had infected the system and needed to be clinically, mercilessly eradicated. "She died," I said, my voice eerily calm, resonating in the silent, terrified container. I gestured to the girl's body. Her name was probably written on one of those encrypted ledgers you were so proud of. "You killed her, Liam, just as surely as if you had put a bullet in her head." Liam scoffed, adjusting his cuffs. Completely insulated by his own narcissism, she's collateral damage in a corporate restructuring. Clara. Numbers on a spreadsheet. You always were too emotional to see the bigger picture. Julian is going to trade his entire empire to get you back, and Marcus is going to wipe him off the map the second the ink is dry. You were nothing but bait. I hope your righteous little crusade was worth it." He turned and walked out, the heavy steel door slamming shut and plunging us back into the suffocating dark. The lock engaged with a heavy, metallic finality, but as I sat in the pitch black, surrounded by the terrified survivors, the despair that had almost drowned me began to crystallize into something entirely different. It hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I gently laid the blanket over the young girl's face, honoring her lost life in the only way I could. Liam thought he had buried me in this warehouse. He thought I was crushed, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of a trauma surgeon. When the monitors flatline, we do not surrender to the dark. We break the ribs. We shock the heart. I wiped the blood from my hands onto my pants, my mind calculating, analyzing, and preparing for the war that was about to breach these walls. Julian Thorne was coming, and when he arrived, I would not be a weeping victim waiting to be rescued. I would be the scalpel that cut Marcus Sterling's empire to the bone. The man I was finally trusting traded my life to save his empire, or so I thought. Time lost all meaning in the subterranean darkness of the shipping container. I measured the passing hours by the fading body heat of the young girl I had failed to save, the rhythmic, terrified breathing of the women huddled around me, and the agonizing throb of the sedative wearing off in my veins. Eventually, the heavy steel door groaned open again, and rough hands hauled me upright, dragging me away from the other captives. They pulled me down a labyrinth of damp, concrete corridors that smelled of diesel fuel and rotting salt water, finally throwing me into a stark, windowless interrogation room. I was slammed into a heavy metal chair, my wrists brutally zip-tied behind my back, the raw nylon cut into my skin, right over the radial artery I relied upon to feel the pulse of my patients. A single blinding halogen lamp was angled directly into my eyes, forcing me to squint against the aggressive glare. When my vision finally adjusted, I saw Marcus Sterling's chief enforcer, a hulking, scarred man named Victor, setting up a heavy-duty military laptop on the scarred folding table in front of me. Liam was nowhere to be seen, likely cowering in a secure office, too cowardly to face the visceral reality of the violence he had orchestrated. Victor connected a thick coaxial cable to the laptop, his thick fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Pay attention, doctor," he grunted, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Mr. Sterling wanted you to have a front row seat to the culmination of your little crusade. He thought you should see exactly what your faith in Julian Thorne is worth before we put you on a cargo ship bound for Eastern Europe." He hit a key, and the screen flickered to life, displaying a high-definition, encrypted live video feed. The camera was positioned in the corner of a lavish, dimly lit private dining room. The mahogany walls, the crystal decanters, and the heavy velvet drapery suggested one of the exclusive, underground syndicate clubs scattered across the city. Sitting at one end of the long table was Marcus Sterling. He exuded an aura of untouchable arrogance, wearing a bespoke suit and a smug, predatory smile that made my stomach churn. And sitting directly across from him, his face carved from impenetrable granite, was Julian. My breath caught in my throat. Seeing him on the screen sent a violent shockwave of adrenaline and desperate hope crashing through my system. He looked immaculate, dressed in a sharp black suit, his posture radiating a calm, lethal authority. I leaned forward against my restraints, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my bruised ribs, waiting for him to unleash the devastating power of the Thorne Syndicate upon the man who had ordered my abduction. I waited for the ultimatum, the declaration of war, the uncompromising demand for my immediate release. Instead, Julian reached out, picked up a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, and took a slow, deliberate sip. "The structural integrity of my organization has been compromised by this feud, Marcus," Julian said, his voice transmitting through the laptop speakers with a chilling, pragmatic detachment. "Your offensive against my logistical hubs and the targeted strikes on my personnel have created an unsustainable operational deficit. I am a businessman. I do not allow sentimentality to bankrupt my family's legacy. You have demonstrated that you are willing to burn this city to the ground over a single civilian." "I am not," Marcus chuckled, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "I'm glad you've finally seen reason. Julian, your father would have been proud of your pragmatism. I told you from the beginning, the doctor was a liability." She poked her nose into a highly lucrative supply chain that did not concern her. Liam was smart enough to recognize the value of our arrangement. It's a shame his brother had to lose a few warehouses to learn the same lesson. Liam is an idiot who couldn't secure his own digital footprint, Julian countered, his voice flat and devoid of any brotherly affection. "But his mistakes are no longer my concern. I am here to negotiate a cessation of hostilities. I will withdraw my tactical teams from your New Jersey shipping routes. I will release the freeze on your offshore accounts. In exchange, you will order your men to stand down, and you will recognize the Thorne Syndicate's absolute sovereignty over the port authorities." "And the woman," Marcus pressed, his predatory smile widening as he leaned closer to the camera. "Knowing I was watching, Dr. Vance is currently a guest in one of my facilities. She knows too much, Julian. She has seen the manifests. She has seen the merchandise. I cannot allow her to walk out of that warehouse breathing. You know the rules of this world better than anyone. I stared at the screen, my entire universe narrowing to the square of pixels displaying Julian's face. Say no, I pleaded silently, my chest constricting with a suffocating, paralyzing dread. Tell him no. Tell him you'll burn his empire to ash. But Julian did not blink. His expression remained utterly devoid of emotion, a flawless mask of sociopathic indifference. Dr. Vance was a temporary asset, Julian said smoothly, dismissing my entire existence with a wave of his hand. Her medical expertise was useful for a time, but her moral crusade has become a catastrophic liability to my bottom line. I have no further use for her. Do what you will with her. Marcus, consider her a peace offering. My only stipulation is that you utilize your contacts in the federal task force to ensure her disappearance does not trace back to the Thorne estate. Have your corrupt badges pick her up, process her as a fugitive resisting arrest, and bury her deep. The third and final peak of disappointment crashed over me, obliterating my remaining defenses and grinding my spirit into dust. The devastation was absolute, a physical agony that radiated from my chest and paralyzed my limbs. He had traded me. The man who claimed to have loved me from the shadows for 11 years. The man who had promised to stand beside me and fight the darkness, had just sold my life to protect his profit margins. Liam's betrayal had been born of cowardice and greed. Julian's betrayal was born of cold, calculated sociopathy. It was the ultimate Judas kiss. I closed my eyes, tears of absolute despair spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. I had been a fool to believe that a syndicate boss possessed a soul. I had been an arrogant, naive fool to think that my intellect and my morality could reform a monster. In their world, women were nothing more than currency, and I had just been spent to balance a ledger. Excellent. Marcus beamed, pulling a heavy silver pen from his pocket. I have a team of federal marshals standing by on my payroll. They are en route to the warehouse now to collect the doctor. They will transport her to a black site, and she will quietly cease to exist. You have a deal. Julian, let's formalize it. Julian replied, pulling a document from his interior jacket pocket and laying it flat on the mahogany table. As Julian leaned forward to sign the treaty, he rested his left hand flat against the polished wood of the table, directly in the center of the camera's frame. My tear-blurred eyes instinctively tracked the movement. For 11 years, Julian Thorne had been a phantom, a shadow operating on the periphery of my life. But over the past 48 hours, I had studied him with the intense, clinical scrutiny of a surgeon. I knew the cadence of his breathing. I knew the microexpressions of his jaw, and I remembered a specific, quiet moment in his library. Just hours after he had rescued me from the compromised transport van, I had been hyperventilating, drowning in a panic attack, and he had knelt in front of me, pressing his index and middle fingers firmly and against the inside of my wrist, right over my radial artery. Focus on the pulse. Clara, he had commanded, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. 72 beats per minute. A perfect, healthy resting rhythm. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. That is the rhythm of survival. Memorize it. When the terror tries to drown you, you tap that rhythm out, and you remember that you are in control. I stared at the screen. Julian's left hand, resting casually on the table, was not entirely still. His index and middle fingers were lifting and falling against the mahogany wood in a deliberate, measured cadence. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 pause. 72 beats per minute, a perfect, healthy, resting radial pulse. The breath caught in my throat, a shockwave of electric realization instantly burning away the suffocating fog of my despair. He wasn't betraying me, he was communicating with me. He was looking directly into the camera lens, through the encrypted feed, and telling me to hold on. He was telling me that he was in control. The federal marshals Marcus had mentioned, The ones currently en route to the warehouse were not corrupt agents coming to execute me. They were the cavalry. She's all yours, Marcus, Julian said, his fingers continuing to tap the rhythm of survival against the wood. I expect the perimeter of my docks to be cleared by midnight, before Marcus could reply. The heavy steel door of my interrogation room violently buckled outward, the reinforced hinges screaming in protest as a localized breaching charge detonated with earth-shattering force. Victor, the hulking enforcer, barely had time to reach for the heavy sidearm holstered at his hip before the room was flooded with blinding tactical lasers and the deafening roar of suppressed automatic weapons. 4 men in full tactical gear, wearing the heavy Kevlar vests and windbreakers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, swarmed into the confined space. But they didn't move like standard law enforcement. They moved with the brutal, hyper-aggressive synchronization of a syndicate death squad. 2 of the men tackled Victor to the concrete floor, disarming him with bone-snapping efficiency and driving the butt of a rifle into his temple, instantly rendering him unconscious. The lead agent, a man whose face was obscured by a heavy ballistic mask, rushed toward me. He didn't read me, my Miranda writes, and he didn't secure me for transport. He pulled a heavy combat knife from his vest and swiftly sliced through the thick nylon zip ties binding my wrists. As my arms fell forward, the agonizing rush of blood returning to my hands making me wince, the agent pushed his ballistic mask up, revealing the severe, scarred features of Julian's tactical lieutenant. Silas, I breathed, my voice cracking with overwhelming relief. The boss said to tell you he apologizes for the theatrics. Dr. Silas grunted, pulling a spare Kevlar vest from his rig and shoving it into my chest. Put this on and keep your head down. We have 80 seconds to secure the package before Sterling's perimeter guards realize the feed was a localized loop, and this entire warehouse turns into a slaughterhouse. The women, I demanded, shrugging into the heavy tactical vest and grabbing Silas by the straps of his rig, my surgical authority completely overriding my physical exhaustion. There is a shipping container in the main holding bay. There are 14 trafficking victims locked inside and 1 deceased minor. I am not leaving this facility without them. Do you understand me? Silas looked down at me, the contempt he had shown me in the library entirely gone, replaced by a grim, undeniable respect. He keyed his shoulder microphone. Bravo, team. Adjust extraction parameters. We are acquiring the cargo. Secure the main holding container and prep the heavy transport. The doctor says we are taking everyone home. I didn't just clear my name. I cured the disease. The tactical extraction from Marcus Sterling's subterranean warehouse was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, executed with a surgical precision that left the rival syndicate completely paralyzed. By the time Sterling realized that Julian had fed him a dynamically generated deepfake video loop during their negotiation, Silas and his elite tactical team had already breached the perimeter, neutralized the hostile guards, and loaded every single surviving woman onto a heavily armored convoy. As we breached the surface and drove into the blinding light of the early morning sun, I sat in the back of the medical transport, my hands steady as I initiated eyes lines and administered broad-spectrum antibiotics to the severely malnourished victims. I was no longer a frightened hostage, nor was I a pawn caught in a mafia power struggle. I was Dr. Clara Vance, chief of trauma surgery, and I was exactly where I belonged, standing between innocent lives and the abyss. The fallout from the raid was catastrophic for Marcus Sterling's empire, but it was a triumph of justice meticulously orchestrated by Julian Thorne. Julian did not rely on the corrupt factions of the federal government. Instead, he leveraged the evidence we had decrypted in the bunker to contact a highly insulated, rigorously vetted joint task force operating out of Washington, D.C., completely bypassing the compromised local authorities. Within 48 hours of our extraction, the FBI raided Sterling's corporate headquarters. His offshore accounts were frozen by international regulatory bodies, and his vast, horrific human trafficking network was systematically dismantled. The sheer volume of encrypted ledgers, shipping manifests, and security footage Julian handed over provided an airtight, undeniable chain of evidence. And at the very center of that web of corruption, hopelessly entangled in his own arrogance, was Liam Thorne. 3 days after the raid, I walked into the sterile, high-security visitation room of the Federal Detention Center in Lower Manhattan. The heavy steel door locked behind me with a resounding clank. I was dressed in a pristine, tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfect, my medical license officially reinstated by the state board, and my reputation entirely exonerated by a highly publicized press conference earlier that morning. Sitting on the opposite side of the scratched plexiglass partition, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit and heavy iron shackles, was the man who had tried to destroy me. Liam looked hollowed out, his perfectly styled hair greasy and unkempt, the suave, charismatic executive facade completely eroded by the brutal reality of his incarceration. He picked up the heavy black receiver, his hands trembling violently. I picked up my end of the line, my expression absolutely devoid of emotion. I did not feel the burning sting of betrayal, nor did I feel the hollow ache of lost love. I felt the clinical, detached observation of a physician examining a necrotic tumor that had finally been excised from a healthy body. Clara, Liam gasped, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic hope. Clara, you came. I knew you would come. You have to listen to me. I was coerced. Marcus forced me to use your credentials. He threatened to kill me if I didn't comply. You have Julian's ear now. You have to talk to my brother. Tell him to pull his lawyers off the prosecution. Tell him I'll testify against Marcus. I'll give them everything. I just can't survive in here. Clara, please. I looked at him, letting his pathetic, cowardly pleas echo in the silence of the receiver. He expected anger. He expected tears. He expected the empathetic, forgiving woman he had manipulated for 3 years. But that woman had died on the concrete floor of a shipping container, holding the lifeless body of a trafficked child. I didn't come here to save you. Liam, I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through his hysteria like a scalpel through diseased tissue. I came here to look at you one last time, to ensure that the pathology was completely eradicated. You thought you were the smartest man in the room. You thought you could use my dedication to healing as a shield for your depravity. But you fundamentally misunderstood the nature of medicine. We don't negotiate with a virus. We isolate it. We neutralize it. And we discard it. Liam stared at me, his mouth opening and closing in mute, terrified shock, finally realizing that the absolute zero in my eyes was real. The federal prosecutor informed me this morning that they are pursuing consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for your role in the trafficking ring. I continued, my voice never rising above a measured, professional cadence. Julian will not help you. He has legally disowned you, severing your name from the Thorne family trust. You have absolutely nothing left. You are going to spend the rest of your natural life in a concrete box, suffocating in the dark, surrounded by monsters who are much bigger and much crueler than you are. And I want you to remember, for every single day of those decades, that the woman you tried to bury was the one who locked the door. I hung up the receiver, severing the connection before he could utter another word. I turned on my heel and walked out of the visitation room, my head held high, leaving Liam Thorne screaming my name in the soundproof booth, a forgotten ghost fading into the absolute ruin of his own making. That evening, the atmosphere at the Thorne estate was remarkably quiet, devoid of the frenetic, militant energy that had characterized the past week. Julian and I stood on the expansive stone balcony extending from the main library, looking out over the dense, forested hills of the Hudson Valley. The sky was a brilliant tapestry of bruised purples and deep oranges as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. I leaned against the heavy stone balustrade, holding a glass of aged scotch, letting the profound, hard-won peace wash over my exhausted spirit. Julian stood beside me, not behind me, not guarding me from the shadows, but standing shoulder to shoulder as an equal. The board of directors formally voted to reinstate you as chief of surgery this afternoon, Julian said, his deep voice harmonizing with the quiet rustle of the wind through the pines. They are offering a substantial public apology and a massive expansion to the trauma department's operational budget to compensate for the damages. I accepted the reinstatement, I replied, turning my head to look at his sharp, handsome profile in the fading light. But I submitted a counter-proposal. I am opening a specialized state-of-the-art trauma and rehabilitation clinic specifically designed for survivors of human trafficking and severe domestic abuse. It will operate independently of the hospital's bureaucratic oversight, ensuring absolute privacy and comprehensive medical, psychological, and legal support for the victims. Julian turned to face me, a slow, breathtaking smile transforming his severe features, radiating an immense, foundational pride. That is going to require a monumental amount of capital and a highly secure logistical infrastructure to protect the patients from retaliation. I know, I said, stepping closer to him, closing the physical distance between us until the heat of his body radiated against my skin, which is why the clinic will be entirely funded and protected by the newly established, completely legitimate philanthropic wing of Thorn Logistics and Security. You promised me a partnership, Julian. We are going to take the empire you built in the dark and use it to fund the light. We are going to cure the disease. Julian reached out, his large hands gently framing my face. There was no hesitation in his touch, no lingering fear that he would corrupt my world. I had seen the absolute worst of his violence, and he had seen the absolute fiercest of my resilience, and we had both survived the crucible unbroken. I spent 11 years believing that I was a monster who didn't deserve to stand in the sun, Julian whispered, his thumbs softly tracing my cheekbones. You didn't just save those women, Clara, you saved me. You gave me a reason to step out of the shadows. I reached up, intertwining my fingers with his, and pulled him down to me. The kiss was not a desperate, adrenaline-fueled collision. It was a profound, deeply vulnerable surrender. It was the sealing of a vow between two equals who had fought through hell to find each other. It tasted of scotch, survival, and the absolute, unwavering certainty that I was finally, truly safe. We broke apart slowly, resting our foreheads together, breathing in the quiet twilight. For a long, beautiful moment, the world was perfect. The war was won. The bad men were locked away, and the future stretched out before us, vast and unburdened. And then, the heavy, reinforced oak doors of the library burst open. Silas stood in the threshold, his chest heaving, his tactical uniform disheveled, and his face drained of all color. He held a glowing satellite phone in his trembling hand. The profound peace of the evening instantly shattered, replaced by the suffocating, familiar chill of impending violence. Julian stepped in front of me, his body instinctively shifting into a protective, combat-ready stance, his hand dropping toward the concealed weapon at his waist. Report, Julian barked, the romantic partner vanishing in a millisecond, replaced by the ruthless syndicate commander. Silas swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Julian and me. Boss, it's the Federal Transport Convoy, the armored unit transporting concerns from the holding facility to the maximum security federal penitentiary in Florence, Colorado. My heart stopped beating. The glass of scotch slipped from my fingers, shattering against the stone balcony. What happened? Silas, I demanded, my voice trembling as the horrifying implication began to dawn on me. They were ambushed, Dr. Silas said, his voice grim and hollow. A heavily coordinated paramilitary strike on the interstate overpass. EMP charges disabled the vehicles, and thermite breached the armor. The federal marshals were entirely wiped out. No survivors. He looked directly into Julian's eyes, delivering the catastrophic payload. The transport is empty. Boss, Marcus Sterling is gone. He's loose in the city, and he's completely off the grid. The devil didn't come with an army. He came bleeding into my sanctuary. The news of Marcus Sterling's escape had triggered an immediate, suffocating lockdown across the Thorne estate, but I refused to cower behind reinforced stone walls. I was the newly reinstated chief of trauma surgery at St. Jude's Memorial, and my place was not in a fortified bunker. It was on the floor of my hospital, directing the healing of those who could not fight for themselves. Julian had argued against my return to work. The lethal, overprotective syndicate boss warring with the man who had promised to treat me as an equal. But I had stood my ground, reminding him that paralyzing fear was exactly what Sterling intended to weaponize. Reluctantly, Julian had conceded, assigning a discreet but heavily armed security detail to monitor the perimeter of the hospital while I worked my overnight shift. The intensive care unit was a highly sterilized, isolated fortress on the 8th floor, accessible only through a biometric security checkpoint. At 3 a.m, the ward was a pristine, humming temple of modern medicine, smelling faintly of bleach and ozone. I was alone at the central nursing station, updating a digital chart for a post-operative cardiac bypass patient. Enveloped in the rhythmic, predictable symphony of mechanical ventilators and cardiac monitors, I felt entirely safe, insulated by the clinical environment that had always been my true home. But the underworld does not respect the boundaries of the sacred. The heavy, pressurized double doors at the far end of the corridor did not hiss open with a standard keycard swipe. They groaned agonizingly before being forced apart with a violent, desperate strength, the magnetic lock sparking and shorting out in a shower of blue sparks. I froze, my hand hovering over the emergency panic button beneath the desk. My trauma instincts instantly transitioning from healer to survivor. A figure staggered through the breach, leaning heavily against the pristine white wall, leaving a thick, smeared trail of dark arterial blood in his wake. He was wearing what remained of a bespoke charcoal suit, the fabric shredded and soaked in a terrifying volume of crimson. He dragged his right leg, his breathing a wet, ragged wheeze that echoed through the silent corridor. As he lifted his head, the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights illuminated the bruised, desperate, and incredibly lethal face of Marcus Sterling. He hadn't come to execute a grand, theatrical revenge. He was a cornered animal, bleeding out from a catastrophic abdominal gunshot wound sustained during his chaotic escape from the federal convoy. Sterling stumbled forward, his left hand pressing a ruined suit jacket against his stomach, his right hand gripping a heavy, matte black semi-automatic pistol. He raised the weapon, his hand trembling violently from the onset of hemorrhagic shock, and pointed the barrel directly at my chest. The muzzle of the gun was terrifyingly large, demanding absolute compliance. But as I looked at the man holding it, the paralyzing terror I had felt in the shipping container was absent. I did not see a mythical, untouchable mafia kingpin. I saw an actively dying patient in the terminal stages of exsanguination. "Don't touch the alarm, doctor," Marcus gasped, his voice a guttural, wet rasp that betrayed the fluid building in his lungs. He advanced toward the nursing station, his boots leaving sticky, red footprints on the polished linoleum. "You press that button, and I put a bullet through your heart before the doors even lock. Step away from the desk." Hands where I can see them. I slowly raised my hands, stepping out from behind the reinforced desk, my mind racing through a frantic, clinical calculus. His skin was ashen, slick with cold diaphoresis. His breathing was tachypneic, desperately fast and shallow, indicating his body was starving for oxygen as his blood volume plummeted. The bullet had likely traversed the lower left quadrant of his abdomen, potentially severing the descending aorta or tearing through the bowel, causing massive internal hemorrhaging. He had minutes, perhaps seconds, before his brain was completely deprived of oxygen and he collapsed into irreversible cardiac arrest. He was holding a gun to my head, but biology was holding a much larger gun to his. "You're dying, Marcus," I stated, my voice eerily calm, devoid of the panic he was so desperately trying to elicit. I kept my eyes locked on his, projecting the absolute, uncompromising authority I wielded in the trauma bay. You have a penetrating traumatic injury to the abdomen. Your pulse is likely over 140 beats per minute. Your blood pressure is bottoming out, and you are currently in Class 3 hemorrhagic shock. You didn't come here to kill me. You came here because you know this is the only room in the city where you can survive the next 10 minutes. Marcus let out a wet, agonizing bark of laughter that quickly dissolved into a violent coughing fit. Blood spattered against the pristine counter of the nursing station. You always were too smart for your own good. Clara, yes, you are going to fix me. You are going to open whatever specialized trauma suite you have back there. You are going to pack my wounds. And you are going to pump me full of whatever drugs I need to stay conscious. And then you are going to walk me down to the basement loading dock, where a car is waiting for me, if you refuse. Or if you try to sedate me, I will empty this magazine into you. He took another staggering step forward, pressing the cold steel of the pistol barrel directly against the center of my forehead. The metallic scent of gunpowder and copper filled my nostrils. I did not flinch. I did not beg. I simply stared into the eyes of the man who had trafficked countless women, the man who had ordered my execution, and felt nothing but an absolute, chilling clinical detachment. I cannot operate on you at gunpoint, I said, my voice steady, reasoning with him not as a hostage, but as a physician stating an incontrovertible medical fact. To stabilize an abdominal wound of this severity, I need both of my hands. I need to establish 2 large-bore intravenous lines, and I need to intubate you. If you hold that gun to my head, you will bleed to death on this floor while I watch. Then you better work fast. Dr. Marcus snarled, his eyes rolling slightly back in his head as another wave of agonizing pain and blood loss washed over him. His grip on the weapon faltered, the barrel slipping an inch down my forehead, before I could move to initiate triage. The shattered double doors at the end of the corridor swung open with the silent, lethal grace of a predator entering a hunting ground. Julian Thorne stepped into the intensive care unit. He did not shout my name. He did not issue a warning. He moved with a terrifying, absolute silence, his dark eyes locked onto the man holding a gun to my head. In his right hand, Julian held a suppressed tactical handgun, perfectly leveled at the back of Marcus Sterling's skull. The air in the ICU instantly plummeted, the sterile environment suddenly suffocated by the immense, crushing gravity of the Thorne Syndicate's wrath. Julian's security detail had undoubtedly intercepted Sterling's men downstairs, and Julian had bypassed the lockdown protocols to eliminate the threat himself. "Drop the weapon, Marcus," Julian commanded. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, glacial whisper that carried the absolute, undeniable promise of death. "You have exactly 3 seconds to pull that gun away from her head before I scatter your brains across this sterile floor." 1. Marcus froze, his dying body tensing as the realization washed over him. He was trapped. He was bleeding out, surrounded by the blinding light of a hospital ward, caught between the woman he wanted to kill and the man who was going to execute him. He let out a desperate, guttural snarl and began to pivot, turning his weapon away from me and attempting to aim it toward Julian. But biology, as always, was the ultimate arbiter. As Marcus aggressively shifted his weight, his blood pressure catastrophically plummeted. His knees buckled, his eyes rolling back in his head as his brain was entirely deprived of oxygen. The heavy pistol slipped from his trembling, blood-slicked fingers, clattering loudly against the linoleum floor. Marcus collapsed in a heap of ruined bespoke fabric and pooling blood, unconscious and actively dying at my feet. Julian stepped forward immediately, his weapon still drawn, his eyes fixed on the man on the floor. He didn't rush to comfort me. His syndicate instincts dictated that the threat must be entirely neutralized before the civilian could be secured. Julian raised his handgun, aiming the suppressed barrel directly at the center of Marcus Sterling's chest, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was going to execute him. He was going to end the war, erase the threat, and protect me in the only language the underworld truly understood. Julian. No, I shouted, the trauma surgeon in me violently overriding the traumatized hostage. I threw myself forward, stepping directly over Marcus's bleeding body, placing my own chest directly in the path of Julian's drawn weapon. Julian froze, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he fought his kinetic momentum to avoid pulling the trigger. Clara, step aside. He ordered your execution. He trafficked those women. He is a monster, and he does not deserve to breathe the same air as you. Step aside and let me finish this. No, I demanded, planting my feet firmly, my eyes blazing with a fierce, uncompromising fire. Look around you, Julian. Look at where we are. This is my operating floor. This is my sanctuary. In this building, on my watch, we do not play God. We do not execute unconscious men on the floor, no matter what they have done. He will escape again, Julian argued, his voice strained with the agonizing tension of a man trying to protect the woman he loved from her own morality. If he survives tonight, he will manipulate the federal system. He will buy new judges. He will come after you again. I will not allow you to live in fear. Let me protect you. I reached out, wrapping both of my hands around the barrel of Julian's weapon, slowly and deliberately lowering it toward the ground. He did not resist. He let me disarm the violence within him, surrendering his absolute authority to my unyielding ethical boundaries. You spent 11 years protecting me in the dark, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a fierce, passionate whisper, forcing him to look into my eyes. But we are in the light now. If you put a bullet in his chest, you are no better than he is. You prove that the underworld is right, that violence is the only true currency. I refuse to accept that. I refuse to let Marcus Sterling turn you back into a murderer. True justice isn't a bullet in a quiet hospital ward. True justice is Marcus Sterling surviving tonight, so he can be dragged into a federal courtroom, forced to look into the eyes of the women he tortured, and stripped of every ounce of his power in front of the entire world. That is how we cure the disease. We let the light burn him. Julian stared at me, the tension slowly draining from his rigid posture as the truth of my words penetrated the armor he had worn for a decade. He saw not a naive idealist, but a warrior whose strength lay in her absolute refusal to be corrupted by the darkness she fought. Slowly, deliberately, Julian holstered his weapon. He stepped back, relinquishing his claim on Marcus Sterling's life, and surrendered the battlefield entirely to me. I did not waste a single second. I spun around, slamming my fist into the emergency code blue button on the wall. The ICU erupted into a chaotic symphony of alarms, strobe lights, and the rapid, approaching footsteps of my trauma team. I dropped to my knees beside the man who had tried to destroy me, ignoring the blood soaking into my slacks. I ripped Marcus's ruined shirt open, exposing the catastrophic abdominal wound. I pressed my bare hands directly into the raw, bleeding tissue, applying massive, targeted pressure to the severed artery, fighting with every ounce of my brilliant, unyielding intellect to keep the devil alive. I was Dr. Clara Vance, and on my floor, life was the absolute, undeniable law. I didn't just survive the fire. I learned how to control the flames. 6 months had passed since the violent, chaotic night in the intensive care unit, a period of time that felt like both a fleeting breath and an entire lifetime. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was a towering monolith of granite and glass, serving as the grand, unyielding stage for the final act of Marcus Sterling's destruction. The trial had been a highly publicized media circus, dragging the darkest, most horrific secrets of the city's criminal underbelly into the blinding light of the national press. Sitting in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Silas and a contingent of highly trained, entirely legitimate private security contractors, I watched the scales of justice permanently tip. Marcus Sterling looked entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, bespoke billionaire who had orchestrated my kidnapping, confined to a wheelchair due to the extensive nerve damage caused by his abdominal trauma. He appeared shrunken, hollow, and utterly defeated. The federal prosecutors, armed with the undeniable, decrypted ledgers Julian had provided and the devastating, courageous testimonies of the rescued women, had dismantled his defense with surgical precision. When the judge struck his gavel, sentencing Marcus Sterling to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole in a maximum security federal penitentiary, there was no dramatic outburst. There was only a heavy, profound silence. The collective exhalation of a city finally breathing clean air. Marcus was wheeled out of the courtroom, his eyes never meeting the gallery, a ruined king banished forever to a concrete tomb. Liam Thorne's conclusion had been far less theatrical, fitting perfectly with the pathetic, cowardly nature of his existence. Terrified of a public trial and desperate to avoid the maximum penalty, Liam had accepted a catastrophic plea deal. He had pled guilty to multiple counts of grand larceny, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking, earning himself 20 years in a mid-level federal facility. He had attempted to contact me from prison dozens of times, begging for a character reference, pleading for Julian's financial intervention. I had blocked his number, returning his letters unopened, entirely excising his memory from my life. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale of narcissism and greed, and I simply did not have the time to mourn a man who had never truly existed. The end of the trial marked the closing of a traumatic chapter, but it was the beginning of an entirely new, brilliant reality. Later that afternoon, under the clear, crisp skies of a New York autumn, Julian and I stood before the sleek, modern glass facade of a newly constructed medical facility in the heart of Brooklyn. The polished chrome letters above the entrance read, "The Vance Center for Trauma and Recovery." It was not a hidden safe house or an underfunded charity clinic. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar medical campus designed explicitly for the comprehensive, long-term rehabilitation of human trafficking survivors and victims of extreme domestic violence. The facility housed state-of-the-art surgical suites, psychiatric recovery gardens, and highly secure residential wings. It was a fortress of healing, and entirely immune to the bureaucratic red tape and financial constraints of the standard healthcare system. "It's incredible," Clara, Julian said, his deep voice resonating with a quiet, foundational awe as we walked through the sunlit, meticulously designed atrium. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, looking every inch the legitimate corporate magnate he had fought so hard to become. "You took the worst experience of your life and you turned it into a sanctuary. You built an empire out of empathy." "We built it, Julian," I corrected, stopping in the center of the atrium and turning to face him. "This clinic wouldn't exist without the foundational endowment from Thorne Logistics. You liquidated the illicit assets. You dismantled the violent factions of your family's syndicate. And you redirected an entire empire toward the light. You provided the shield. I just provided the scalpels." The transition had not been easy for Julian. Dismantling a generational mafia syndicate required a terrifying intelligence, brutal internal restructuring, and an absolute, uncompromising commitment to walking away from the shadows. He had faced down rebellions within his own ranks, surviving assassination attempts from loyalists who viewed his turn toward legitimate corporate security as a weakness. But he had not fought those battles in secret. For the first time in his life, he had shared the burden, treating me as his confidant, his strategist, and his equal. We had weathered the violent storms together, our bond forging into something unbreakable, forged in the crucible of absolute honesty. That evening, we hosted a private, quiet celebration back at the Thorne estate. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had once defined the brutalist stone fortress was entirely gone, replaced by the warmth of roaring fireplaces, the soft glow of amber lighting, and the quiet, relaxed laughter of the people we trusted most. Cypher was currently attempting to explain advanced cryptography to a bewildered but highly amused Silas in the corner of the library. while a handful of my most trusted surgical colleagues from St. Jude's mingled with Julian's reformed, newly licensed corporate security directors. It was a beautiful, chaotic blending of two worlds that had once been violently opposed, now harmonizing under the banner of mutual respect and shared purpose. As the evening wound down and the guests began to filter out into the crisp night air, Julian and I slipped away, making our way up the grand staircase to the expansive, private stone balcony that overlooked the estate and the distant, glittering skyline of the city. The air was cold, biting at my cheeks, but I felt incredibly warm, insulated by the heavy wool coat Julian draped over my shoulders. He stepped up beside me, leaning his forearms against the heavy stone balustrade, looking out at the vast expanse of the world we had conquered together. I looked at him, studying the profile of the man who had loved me in silence for a decade. The lines of exhaustion and the heavy, terrifying vigilance that had once characterized his every movement were gone. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who had finally realized that he did not have to earn his right to exist through suffering and violence. He had spent 11 years standing in the dark for me, terrified that if he stepped into the light, his demons would drag me down with him. But he had learned the most profound lesson of our journey. The light does not burn you if you stand in it with someone who knows your truth and loves you anyway. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked softly, turning his head to catch me staring at him. A slow, incredibly tender smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I was thinking about the first time you brought me here," I said, stepping closer, closing the distance until my shoulder pressed firmly against his chest. I was terrified. I thought I had just traded one monster for another. "I stood in your library and demanded that you treat me as an equal, expecting you to laugh in my face. Instead, you gave me the keys to your empire and asked me to help you tear it down." Julian shifted, turning his body fully toward me. He reached out, his large hands gently cupping my face, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones with a reverence that still managed to steal my breath. "I spent my entire life surrounded by people who either feared me or wanted to use me. You were the only person who ever looked at me and demanded that I be a better man. You didn't run from the darkness, Clara. You walked right into the center of it, grabbed my hand, and dragged me out. You were the only fight I ever had that was actually worth winning. And the war is finally over," I whispered, reaching up to lay my hands over his, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse beating strongly at his wrists. No more shadow ledgers. No more watching from a distance. No more standing behind me to take the bullet. "Never again," Julian vowed, leaning down to press his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin, mixing with the cool night air. "Beside you, Clara, only beside you, for the rest of our lives. We stand in the light." I tilted my head up, capturing his lips in a slow, deep, and profoundly absolute kiss. There was no desperation in it, no adrenaline-fueled panic of survival. It was a kiss built on a foundation of unyielding trust, immense respect, and a love that had defied every law of the brutal world that tried to extinguish it. We had lost careers, we had faced betrayal, and we had stared down the absolute worst of humanity. But as we stood on the balcony, equals in every sense of the word, watching the dawn begin to paint the edges of the city in brilliant, unbroken light, I knew with absolute certainty that we had won. The shadows were gone, and the future was ours to heal. And so the shadows finally recede, leaving us in the unbreakable light of a new dawn. As we close the final chapter of Clara and Julian's journey, it is vital to pause and reflect on the profound truths woven into the very fabric of this story. At its core, this is not merely a tale of underworld syndicates, dramatic rescues, or the thrill of mafia romance. It is a deeply human exploration of agency, the true nature of power, and the terrifying, beautiful process of reclaiming your own life after a devastating betrayal. For so many of us, it is easy to find ourselves trapped in the illusion of safety. Clara believed she was protected by the man she was going to marry, insulated by her prestigious career and her relentless dedication to healing others. But Leah Eames represented the insidious nature of toxic control, the kind of manipulation that wears a tailored suit, smiles for the cameras, and secretly views a partner not as an equal, but as a convenient asset to be exploited. His betrayal stripped Clara of everything she thought she was, pushing her into a dark, suffocating abyss where her intellect and her white coat could no longer shield her. Yet, it was in that very darkness that Clara discovered the truest measure of her own strength. And this is the first profound lesson this narrative offers. Our absolute moments do not define us, they forge us. When Clara was thrown into a shipping container with trafficked women, stripped of her titles and her tools, she did not wait to be rescued. She bled, she fought, and she offered empathy when she had nothing else left to give. She realized that true power is not wielded with a gun, a stolen bank account, or a corrupt corporate title. True power is the unwavering, unapologetic commitment to your own moral compass, even when the entire world is trying to force you to compromise. She didn't let the violence of the underworld turn her into a monster. Instead, she forced the monster to step into the light. She reminded us that the ultimate victory over those who abuse and betray us is not just survival, but the fierce refusal to let their darkness extinguish our humanity. This brings us to the profound contrast between the two brothers, and what this story teaches us about the anatomy of real, mature love. We are often conditioned by fairy tales and popular media to desire a knight in shining armor summon to swoop in, solve our problems, and lock us away in a safe, gilded tower. But Julian Thorne represents a radical, much healthier evolution of romance. For 11 years, he loved Clara enough to let her thrive without him. When they were finally brought together, he did not try to possess her, cage her, or shield her from the brutal realities of his world by lying to her. He handed her the truth, raw and unvarnished, and offered her a choice. True love, as Julian and Clara demonstrate, is not about a man standing in front of a woman to shield her, nor is it about standing behind her in the shadows to silently direct her path. It is about standing shoulder to shoulder, as absolute equals. It is about finding a partner who respects your boundaries, reveres your intellect, and trusts you enough to hand you the keys to their empire and say, "We fight this war together." Ultimately, Clara and Julian's story is a testament to the fact that it is never too late to rewrite your own narrative. No matter how deeply you have been betrayed, no matter how much of your life you feel you have lost to the wrong person, your foundation remains yours to rebuild. You are allowed to demand respect. You are allowed to set uncompromising boundaries. And you are absolutely allowed to walk away from anyone who views your light as something to be managed rather than something to be worshipped. We hope this story reminds you of your own inherent strength, your right to absolute equality, and the beautiful truth that the greatest romances are not built on rescue, but on mutual respect. Thank you for walking through the fire with us on the Dark Romance Stories channel. And as always, remember to keep your standards high, your boundaries firm, and your heart open to the light.